and welcome or welcome back. This video is part 3 of my series on what I would change about the Hogwarts houses. As I mentioned in my other videos, I don't find the Hogwarts houses other than Gryffindor to be particularly well written, and I don't think that their students generally demonstrate the key qualities or values that are supposed to be associated with that house. So in these 3 videos, I'm talking about how I would change that in order to make the Hogwarts houses a little bit more complex, a little bit more believable, more varied as far as their students' personalities and choices, and more representative of the traits and values that are supposed to be associated with them. In the first video, I talked about Hufflepuff, in the second one, I talked about Slytherin, and in the third video, I'm going to talk about Ravenclaw. Now, I'm probably going to be a little bit more nitpicky here than I was in the other 2. I certainly found plenty to criticize in the other 2, but Ravenclaw is the Hogwarts house that I identify with the most strongly, so yeah, I've got a lot to say. With that being said, let's get started. So first of all, let me talk about what I see as the problems as far as Ravenclaw House and how it is written. The first and most important thing is that, much like I said about Slytherin and ambition, Ravenclaw is supposed to be associated with intelligence, knowledge, and learning, but the most highly intelligent or academically minded characters tend to not be Ravenclaws, and we never really meet any Ravenclaw characters other than maybe Professor Flitwick, who actually show any strong inclination towards knowledge or learning. Now, it could totally be that that's going on in the background, and it's just never mentioned, but I think that if that's the case, that's a problem. And if it's just really the case that none of the most intelligent or most motivated students are Ravenclaws, that's a problem too, given that that's what they're supposed to value the most. Secondly, the Pottermore welcome letter attempted to define Ravenclaw as the house for eccentric intellectuals, people who are a little bit outside the norm, who march to the beat of their own drum. And on some level, that kind of does make sense, because Luna fits that description, and she's the most prominent Ravenclaw character in the Harry Potter series. The problem is that Luna is something of an outlier, and she's bullied by the other Ravenclaws. There's no indication that that sort of eccentric personality is at all accepted. Now, it makes sense that if Ravenclaws value knowledge and learning, they might also tend to be open-minded and intellectually curious, and therefore willing to consider ideas that others aren't. But I think that if that's the case, it should be shown, and not with just one character who's kind of an outsider and doesn't have any friends. Another thing that I have noticed is that Ravenclaw produces the most unpleasant or villainous characters other than Slytherin, but it's never really addressed why that might be. And I actually don't mind that that's the case. I think it's actually kind of interesting that that's the case. And I think it makes sense, because the pursuit of knowledge, in the absence of, morals or ethics, can definitely lead down the wrong path. What we end up actually seeing, though, is characters like Professor Lockhart or Marietta Edgecombe, who really just don't have any morals, and that's all there is to it. I would actually be much more interested in seeing like a mad scientist type character who pursues knowledge in unethical ways than someone like Professor Lockhart, who honestly seems to be a Ravenclaw by process of elimination in the way that Peter Pettigrew is a Gryffindor by process of elimination, and not someone who really exemplifies Ravenclaw qualities. And then finally, there's just a lack of Ravenclaw characters all around. There are no known Ravenclaw alumni among either the Order of the Phoenix, the Aurors, or the Death Eaters, meaning that they are the only Hogwarts house whose graduates don't really take part in the conflict that forms the core of the series. And while there are, of course, named Ravenclaw student characters, they play almost no role in the first few books, and it's really only Luna and Cho that play an important role after that. Unlike with the other 3 houses, the most prominent Ravenclaw character is not introduced until Book 5 out of 7. So for the most part, Ravenclaw House just kind of tends to blend into the background. As you can probably imagine, this leaves me with a lot of things that I would like to see done differently. So, like with the other 2 videos, I'm going to go through book by book and give examples of things that I would change in order to make Ravenclaw House more prominent and more complex and interesting. Unlike with Hufflepuff and Slytherin, I don't have an issue with how Ravenclaw House is first introduced. The first time that we hear about it is from Hermione, who says that she hopes she's a Gryffindor because they sound by far the best, but that she doesn't suppose Ravenclaw would be too bad. I don't have an issue with that. I feel like that is an accurate representation of how Hermione probably sees them. And it's not anything unnecessarily negative, like Hagrid's comment about Hufflepuffs being a lot of duffers, or blatantly inaccurate, like the idea that there's not a single witch or wizard gone bad who wasn't a Slytherin. So really, I think that the lead up to the Sorting Hat song and what the Sorting Hat says about Ravenclaw, you might belong in Ravenclaw if you've a ready mind where those of wit and learning will always find their kind, I feel like that's accurate and appropriate. However, what I would do in that early part of the first book where Hermione has not yet befriended Harry and Ron, I think I would hint that maybe she is regretting her strong preference for Gryffindor and might have fit better into Ravenclaw. Now, I don't think that she actually would, and by the end of the book, her line about, books and cleverness, there are more important things, that shows why she was meant to be a Gryffindor, as does just her involvement with all of Harry's exploits throughout the entire series. But I feel like setting up that kind of question of would it have been better if Hermione was a Ravenclaw, and then giving the answer of no, she belongs in Gryffindor by the end of the book, would work a little bit better than just never raising the question to begin with. In the same way that Harry spends Chamber of Secrets questioning whether he should have been a Slytherin, but then by the end of the book he's pulling the sort of Gryffindor out of the hat. So I think I would mention something like this during the aftermath of the Wingardium Leviosa scene. This is the original version. Someone knocked into Harry as they hurried past him. It was Hermione. Harry caught a glimpse of her face and was startled to see that she was in tears. I think she heard you. So, said Ron, but he looked a bit uncomfortable. She must have noticed she's got no friends. And here's what I would add to it. That, unfortunately, was quite true, and Harry couldn't help wondering if Hermione would have been happier in a different house. After all, the only people who seemed to tolerate her were Anthony Goldstein and Padma Patil from Ravenclaw, with whom she was occasionally seen studying. This would also be a good place to pull some things from the Pottermore welcome letter that I was talking about, as far as Ravenclaws having obscure or kind of quirky interests that might be seen as weird by other people. And that could be a hint as to why Hermione is actually not in Ravenclaw. So from the section where they're looking for information on Nicholas Flamel, he, Ron, and Hermione had already agreed that they had better not ask Madame Pince where they could find Flamel. They were sure she'd be able to tell them, but they couldn't risk Snape hearing what they were up to. And here is what I would add. For very different reasons, Hermione had also refused to mention it to her Ravenclaw study partners Anthony and Padma. One of them might know, she admitted, but if they do, it'll be because they're really interested in some obscure branch of magic, and then we'll spend the entire hour talking about, I don't know, enchanting magical portraits or using egg yolks to tell fortunes instead of going over the homework. The thing about fortune-telling using egg yolks actually comes straight from the Pottermore welcome letter and is something that I feel like Hermione would have absolutely no patience or respect for. And then remember what I said about how none of the top students or the most highly intelligent characters seem to be Ravenclaws? I would change that. I would still have Hermione be at the top of the class because, of course she is. But I would have the student placing second under her be from Ravenclaw. One place that could be added is in this section at the end of the first book where their exam results come in. Harry had almost forgotten that the exam results were still to come, but come they did. To their great surprise, both he and Ron had passed with good marks. Hermione, of course, had the best grades of the first years. Even Neville scraped through, his good herbology mark making up for his abysmal potions one. They had hoped that Goyle, who was almost as stupid as he was mean, might be thrown out, but he had passed too. So we could add in there a mention of a Ravenclaw student doing well. To their great surprise, both he and Ron had passed with good marks. Hermione, of course, had the best grades of the first years, although Anthony was a close second. Even Neville scraped through, his good herbology mark, blah 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 blah. In book 2, one of the big changes that I would make is that I would introduce Luna at the first possible opportunity. I really like Luna. She's one of my favorite Harry Potter characters, and so it's partially just me wanting her there earlier, but I do think it's a problem that the most important Ravenclaw character isn't introduced until book 5, and I think that she could have been there in the early books, particularly in Chamber of Secrets. She starts at Hogwarts that year, and I'm sure that she would have opinions about what's going on with the chamber. Probably ones that would be very incorrect, but oddly perceptive in their own way. So here is where I would introduce Luna. Harry spent a lot of time over the next few days dodging out of sight whenever he saw Gilderoy Lockhart coming down a corridor. Harder to avoid was Colin Creevey, who seemed to have memorized Harry's class schedule. Nothing seemed to give Colin a bigger thrill than to say, "All right, Harry, 6 or 7 times a day, and here." "Hello, Colin, back," however exasperated Harry sounded when he said it. And then my addition to that. Ducking around the corner to avoid Colin, Harry nearly ran straight into Ginny Weasley, who was walking side by side with a small blonde girl he didn't recognize. He muttered an apology. Ginny's face flushed. "It's all right," said the blonde girl in a soft, dreamy sort of voice. "Your head is obviously full of rackspurts." Baffled, Harry asked, "What are rackspurts?" The blonde girl began to answer, but Ginny cut her off. "They don't exist." The girl didn't appear upset in the least to hear that. She peered intently at Harry with big blue eyes. "You're Harry Potter," she said a moment later. It was a statement of fact, not a question. Yes, I am." "This is Luna Lovegood," said Ginny. "She's in my year, in Ravenclaw." Once Luna is introduced, she could show up throughout the whole Chamber of Secrets Heir of Slytherin business and have lots to say about it. For instance, I feel like if she and Ginny became friends at this point, she would express concern about Ginny at some point, noticing that she's a little bit off, that she's behaving oddly. But because Luna is a bit odd herself, and people just kind of think that Ginny is a little bit unwell or overwhelmed or whatever, it would be kind of dismissed. My impression of Luna Lovegood is that she's not just an airhead, that she's someone who is very observant and perceptive, but who isn't always taken seriously because of how odd she is. I absolutely think, too, that she would not see Harry as the heir of Slytherin, that she would understand that he wasn't the one petrifying everybody. So I already had this in the Hufflepuff video because of what I have Hannah Abbott doing in this scene, but let's revisit it again for the Ravenclaw one. This happens just before Christmas break when Harry is looking forward to the castle emptying out and mostly just him and his friends being left behind. But Harry was glad that most people were leaving. He was tired of people skirting around him in the corridors as though he was about to sprout fangs or spit poison, tired of all the muttering, pointing, and hissing as he passed. And then the modified version. But Harry was glad that most people were leaving. Since the most recent attack, the entire school seemed to have made up their minds that he was the heir of Slytherin. He knew that not everyone suspected him. Luna Lovegood, for one, seemed to find the idea far more absurd than rackspurts, and Hannah Abbott had quietly passed him a note in herbology telling him that she believed he was innocent. Still, it would be nice to see the castle empty out for the holidays. He was tired of people skirting around him in the corridors as though he was about to sprout fangs or spit poison, tired of all the muttering, pointing, and hissing as he passed. And then finally, picking up where I left off with Anthony Goldstein as like the number 2 student after Hermione, I would bring him into Chamber of Secrets as well and have kind of like an academic rivalry between them, but then also I would bring him into the polyjuice potion thing. And not necessarily have him drink it with them, but have him assist with the process of brewing it. Here's how I would do that. "It wears off after a while," said Hermione, waving her hand impatiently. "But getting a hold of the recipe will be very difficult." And then, with my addition, "It wears off after a while," said Hermione, waving her hand impatiently. "And if it's all right with you, I can ask Anthony Goldstein to help us brew it. He's quite good at potions, and I know he's made them outside of class before, but getting a hold of the recipe will be very difficult." That would open up the opportunity for more interactions between them and some banter and friendly academic rivalry. "He is not a brainless git," said Hermione shrilly as they half ran toward the library. "Just because he said you were the best student of the year." They dropped their voices as they entered the muffled stillness of the library. Inserting Anthony into that scene. "He is not a brainless git," said Hermione shrilly as they half ran toward the library. "Just because he said you were the best student of the year." "Who said that, Lockhart?" asked a voice. It was Anthony Goldstein, leaning casually against the wall near the library, waiting for them. "Come on, Hermione, you're way too smart to be won over by that idiot's flattery." Hermione crossed her arms, but she didn't seem angry. "My grades in his class are quite a bit better than yours, aren't they?" she said. "Only because what he's teaching is useless," said Anthony. "Seriously, quiz questions about his favorite color? Composing a poem about how he took down that werewolf? What's the point of that?" Hermione blushed bright pink. "Anyway," she said, "I got the signature. We're all set." Anthony nodded, and the 4 of them dropped their voices as they entered the muffled stillness of the library. Having someone who frequently compares grades and how they're doing in their classes with Hermione could prove to be helpful as far as showing how crazy Hermione's schedule is during the 3rd book as well, and how much more work she's taken on than the usual high-achieving students. Here is what Ron says about Hermione's class schedule in Prisoner of Azkaban. I heard her talking to Professor Vector, that arithmancy witch, this morning. They were going on about yesterday's lesson, but Hermione can't have been there, because she was with us in care of magical creatures. And Ernie Macmillan told me she's never missed a Muggle Studies class, but half of them are at the same time as Divination, and she's never missed one of them either. Adding to that, I ran into Anthony Goldstein the other day, and he seemed really annoyed. Said he couldn't figure out how she was taking more classes than him. He showed me his schedule, and it was absolutely full with just 3 electives. Hermione's taking 5. I mentioned this in the Slytherin video, but with Hermione taking all of these classes that Harry and Ron are not, I would have her join a study group with students from all 4 houses that are taking that subject. I feel like that's the sort of thing that exists and that Hermione would get involved with. Now, I talked in the other video about the implications of it being all 4 houses and therefore Slytherins being there, but I feel like this kind of thing would be really popular with Ravenclaws. I don't think all serious students would be Ravenclaws, or that all Ravenclaws would be academically inclined and serious students, but I do think that there would be a strong correlation between the two. If you're someone who is strongly focused on knowledge and learning and intellectual pursuits, then maybe that would manifest itself in things that have nothing to do with your classes, but in a lot of cases I feel like it would, at least with particular academic subjects. And so maybe at this point, Hermione's joining this study group for ancient runes and it's students from all 4 houses, and did you know that Padma's been checking out books on ancient runes from the library for 2 years already and just couldn't wait to get started? Like, I feel like that's the sort of thing that Ravenclaws would do. The first mention of the Lovegood family, not Luna in particular, but just her family as a whole, was in the section leading up to the Quidditch World Cup in Book 4. When they're about to take the portkey, Mr. Weasley asks Mr. Diggory if they're waiting for anyone else, and Mr. Diggory says that the Lovegoods have been there for a week already, and that another family living nearby couldn't get tickets. So the Lovegoods are at the Quidditch World Cup. During the section when Harry and the others are walking around and running into people that they know, it would be totally natural if they already knew Luna for them to run into her and her father there. And it could just be a quick scene like the one with Seamus Finnegan and his mother, but just a reminder that Luna exists, because then when Harry's name comes out of the Goblet of Fire, I absolutely think that she would be one of the people who believes that he did not put it in there and did not want to be in the tournament, and maybe even would suspect that there's something malicious going on behind it. He could understand the Hufflepuff's attitude, even if he didn't like it. They had their own champion to support. He'd expected nothing less than vicious insults from the Slytherins. He was highly unpopular there and always had been because he had helped Gryffindor beat them so often, both at Quidditch and in the Interhouse Championship. But he had hoped the Ravenclaws might have found it in their hearts to support him as much as Cedric. He was wrong, however. Most Ravenclaws seemed to think he had been desperate to earn himself a bit more fame by tricking the goblet into accepting his name. I think that would be a great place to bring Luna back into it again. One of the few who did believe him was Luna Lovegood, but he could have done without her support. Her theories as to who really put his name in ranged from unlikely to absurd, and hearing the girl whose father ran the Quibbler insist that he was the victim of some sinister conspiracy just made everyone else less likely to believe it. The other thing that needs to be addressed for Goblet of Fire is that in the Hufflepuff video, I had Harry go to the Yule Ball with Hannah Abbott instead of with Parvati Patil, because Harry and Parvati were the ones who arranged for Ron to go with Parvati's sister Padma. That obviously would also be impacted. I feel like if Harry already had a date when he got back to the Gryffindor common room, then he would obviously not have asked Parvati, and maybe Ron would have instead. But I don't want to cut Padma out of it completely, so instead I think I would have her go with Anthony Goldstein. I've already established the two of them as characters, and we know a little bit about them now, including that they're on friendly terms with Hermione and that Harry has some idea of who they are. So I think it would be natural if the two of them went together either as a date or just as friends, and with the stuff that I've added, it seems like that's something that Harry would make note of. And honestly, I feel like going with a friend and dancing and having a good time would be a lot less awkward and unpleasant than going with a virtual stranger who's in a bad mood all night. So Order of the Phoenix is the book where I would address the fact that in those last 3 books with Voldemort back and everything, none of the adults involved in that kind of core conflict are graduates of Ravenclaw House. And it's the only one for which that's the case. So I would identify one of the members of the Order of the Phoenix as a former Ravenclaw. That way it would be people from all 4 houses. And now I've seen people on the internet suggest that Kingsley might have been a Ravenclaw, but I honestly kind of see him as a Hufflepuff, so I wouldn't pick him. I think I might go with Sturgis Podmore because he works at the Department of Mysteries, and that seems like a very Ravenclaw kind of career. Or possibly Daedalus Diggle, because he seems to fit the Pottermore description of Ravenclaws as a little bit eccentric. There are also plenty of background characters and backstory characters that could be identified as having been Ravenclaws, but those are the ones that stand out the most to me as likely options. And then I would also identify Augustus Rookwood as a former Ravenclaw. My logic on this is, first of all, he worked at the Department of Mysteries, and that seems like a very Ravenclaw career. Secondly, he was not suspected at all until Igor Karkaroff turned him in, and it seems like having not been a Slytherin, it might be a lot easier to fly under the radar and not be suspected. I said that I thought there was a missed opportunity for like a mad scientist type character, someone who worked at the Department of Mysteries and who clearly doesn't have a lot of ethics because he joined the Death Eaters would be an excellent choice for that. Of course, that would require him having a bigger role to play in the story. So cycling back around to the Pottermore welcome letter, because I'm referencing that a lot in this video if you can't tell, Ravenclaw comes across as the most neutral of the four houses as far as their relationship to the other three. Gryffindor, as we see from the books, gets along really well with both Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw, but not at all with Slytherin. The Pottermore welcome letter for Hufflepuff referenced Gryffindor as the house that they got along with the best, and had negative things to say about Ravenclaw and even more negative things to say about Slytherin. And the Pottermore letter for Slytherin was very hostile towards all three of the other houses. The Ravenclaw one, on the other hand, offered both praise and criticism for all three. Gryffindors were generally described positively, but also mentioned to be not as accepting of differences as Ravenclaws. Hufflepuffs were said to be some of the nicest people in the school, but not strong competition at exam time, so a bit of a condescending attitude. And new Ravenclaw students were warned that Slytherins are not all bad, but be cautious until you get to know them. So I think that that would be a very interesting dynamic to explore in the Dumbledore's Army section of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. The idea that Ravenclaw House doesn't really have a problem with any of the other three, but also doesn't have a very strong positive relationship with any of the other three. And that they might even perceive house rivalries where the Ravenclaws don't and are content to just live and let live. Particularly because I mentioned in my What I Would Change About Slytherin House video that I would include a small number of Slytherin students in Dumbledore's Army. I think that would set up some interesting inter-house rivalry dynamics to be explored. I'm not exactly sure where I would go with that. I would need more time to think about it. I might make another video at some point what I would do differently with Dumbledore's Army, because I have a lot of thoughts apparently about that, and how I would see the houses interacting, and what they might have been doing off-screen or off-page or whatever during Deathly Hallows, and, you know, lots of stuff. But in any case, for right now, I'm just going to say that I think there's potential there. Also, I said in the Slytherin video that having Slytherins in Dumbledore's Army would make it more of a surprise when Marietta betrayed the group, and since Marietta's a Ravenclaw, I want to expand on that here. This is the scene where it's revealed that Marietta betrayed them to Umbridge. There was a wait of several minutes in which nobody looked at each other, and then Harry heard the door open behind him. Umbridge moved past him into the room, gripping by the shoulder Cho's curly-haired friend Marietta, who was hiding her face in her hands. So I think that if there were Slytherin students in Dumbledore's Army, that would be the perfect moment for Harry to have a fleeting moment of suspicion about them before it's revealed who was really responsible. There was a wait of several minutes in which nobody looked at each other. Harry's mind raced as he tried to think who might have betrayed them. Adrian Pusey, maybe, if he thought his place on the Slytherin Quidditch team was at risk. Or Daphne Greengrass? He had never thought it made sense that Pansy Parkinson's best friend would want anything to do with them. At last he heard the door open behind him. Umbridge moved past him into the room, gripping by the shoulder Cho's curly-haired friend Marietta, who was hiding her face in her hands. My line of thought there is that while as a reader I didn't personally expect Marietta to sell them out, I didn't find it to be particularly shocking when she did, even reading this at like 10 or 11 years old. It certainly wasn't a Quirrell was trying to steal the Sorcerer's Stone kind of moment, but I think it could be made into one if there are other people that Harry thinks, really, like, what are you doing here, and why should we trust you that you're on our side? Marietta is not a Gryffindor. She's not in Harry's year. she's not one of his close friends, and her betrayal ultimately ends his relationship with Cho, which is clearly not meant to last. So really it feels like kind of the easy way out. And it really doesn't look great for Ravenclaw House either. It ends up looking like the Gryffindors are brave and heroic and they're going to do the right thing. The Hufflepuffs are just and loyal and they're not going to betray us, but the Ravenclaws, gotta kind of keep an eye on them. Of course, Luna is in this book, and she's very much a counterexample to that. But I feel like if Marietta's betrayal was set up as more of a shocking twist and less of a, oh yeah, of course, then that effect would be reduced, particularly if there were already other Ravenclaw characters like Anthony and Padma who were more well-developed at this point and more likable rather than just kind of, I mean, they're not unlikable in the books, but they're just kind of in the background. Finally, towards the end of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, students meet with their head of house to discuss their career prospects. We only get very much insight into how Harry's meeting with Professor McGonagall goes down and what sort of things he needs to be doing in preparation for his chosen career as an Auror. However, I think that it would be really interesting to show what some of the other students are thinking and what kind of classes they'll need to take and what they'll need to do after they leave school in order to pursue their chosen careers. I talked about this a little bit in the Slytherin video, but let's talk about it here as well. I feel like a lot of the Ravenclaw students would be wanting to go on to some kind of further study. I know that J.K. Rowling has said that there are no universities for wizards, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no study after Hogwarts. For instance, Harry's told that he'll need to pursue several years of specialized training in order to become an Auror. And I feel like there are other careers as well that would require some amount of higher education. For example, references are made to healer trainees at St. Mungo's, and Charlie Weasley is described as studying dragons in Romania. So even if there's not a formal university, there definitely do seem to be options for higher education that go beyond the Hogwarts level. With that being the case, I would love more scenes in that career advice section where the students, not just Harry, Ron, and Hermione, but, they can eavesdrop on others as well, or I don't know, maybe even talk to other people besides, the three of them. But in any case, I would love more scenes where the students talk about what they want to do after they leave Hogwarts, and maybe some of the Ravenclaws talk about opportunities for further study that they want to pursue. So in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, when their exam results come in for their owls, Hermione is disappointed to have gotten all O's except for one E, exceeds expectations, in Defense Against the Dark Arts. And Ron points that out and is like, you're actually disappointed, aren't you? Actually, the math in this doesn't add up, because Ron says, yep, 10 outstandings and 1 exceeds expectations in Defense Against the Dark Arts. He looked down at her, half amused, half exasperated. You're actually disappointed, aren't you? Hermione was only taking 10 classes by the time that she took her owls, because Ron and Harry are taking 9. 7 of those are core classes that they all take, and the other 2, for Harry and Ron, it's Divination and Care of Magical Creatures, are electives. Hermione drops Divination and Muggle Studies at the end of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, leaving her with just Care of Magical Creatures, Study of Ancient Runes, and Arithmancy, which should be 10, so if she has 10 outstandings and 1 exceeds expectations, what extra class is she taking that we didn't know about? But in any case, that's really not the point. I just had to point that out because, I don't know if maybe that's something like Marcus Flint being in the wrong year in one of the books that's gotten updated in more recent editions, but in my old, battered first edition Half-Blood Prince book, the math is all wrong. Anyway, where Ron suggests that Hermione is disappointed, if we've already established Anthony as the number 2 student in the class, maybe Ron could say something like this. He looked down at her, half amused, half exasperated. You're actually disappointed, aren't you? What, do you think Goldstein got all O's? And then if they compare their exam results later and find that he didn't get an O in Defense Against the Dark Arts either, and maybe it's mentioned at some point that Snape actually had to lower his standards to accept anybody with an O or an E, or maybe even anybody with a passing grade into his Newt level Defense Against the Dark Arts class because there were so few O's in that subject. I think that would make sense given how disjointed the teaching has been for that over the years, and it would really bring home the impressiveness of Harry getting an O in that subject when even the school's top students didn't. Of course, that would require at least some of the Ravenclaws to actually be among the school's top students, which isn't necessarily the case, but I think that it should be, so we're making it the case. Aside from Luna Lovegood, the Ravenclaw students pretty much cease to exist in Half-Blood Prince. They're in his classes, presumably, but they're not really ever mentioned. Even in Potions class, which is only 12 students, there are 4 Ravenclaws. Only 2 of them are ever named, and they only get 1 line of dialogue each that I was able to find. More time is spent in Potions class than any other that year, and there are several Potions lessons shown in quite a bit of detail, but the Ravenclaw students are just kind of over there. It wouldn't be difficult, though, to throw in a couple of mentions of them when Slughorn is looking at people's potions or students are asking questions. Something like this, for instance. Here's the original. Slowly, Slughorn moved around the room, examining the various antidotes. Nobody had finished the task, although Hermione was trying to cram a few more ingredients into her bottle before Slughorn reached her. Ron had given up completely and was merely trying to avoid breathing in the putrid fumes issuing from his cauldron. Harry stood there waiting, the bezoar clutched in a slightly sweaty hand. And here's my version. Slowly, Slughorn moved around the room, examining the various antidotes. Nobody had finished the task, although Padma Patil's concoction earned an encouraging nod and Anthony Goldstein's was deemed a promising start. Hermione was trying to cram a few more ingredients into her bottle before Slughorn reached her. Ron had given up completely and was merely trying to avoid breathing in the putrid fumes issuing from his cauldron. Harry stood there waiting, the bezoar clutched in a slightly sweaty hand. And then finally, in Book 6, I would have Harry make up with Cho. Cho is a difficult character who tends to be unpopular with fans. She doesn't ever actually do anything wrong, but she certainly is not the ideal girlfriend for Harry, and she's not necessarily very easy to like. However, she's also a grief-stricken teenager whose first boyfriend was murdered, and who is reaching out to the only person that she thinks might be impacted by this on a similar level to how she is. In the middle of all of that, her best friend betrays the DA to Umbridge, and she ends up kind of torn between her new boyfriend, Harry, and her friend who sold them out. It all ends in tears, but given that she comes back in Deathly Hallows to fight on Harry's side in the Battle of Hogwarts, clearly we're not meant to think of her as a bad person, just as a person who was going through a difficult time and maybe didn't handle it very well. It's also not like it wasn't partially Harry's fault. He wasn't the ideal boyfriend to her either. So I think it would be nice at some point during Half-Blood Prince, her final year at school, after they've had a little bit of time apart to, they're both dating other people now, they've moved on. It would just be nice for them to encounter each other at some point and talk about it a little bit and realize that, yeah, it wasn't the right relationship, it wasn't the right time, but we're cool now. I think it would be nice for her to express some amount of gratitude towards him for honoring Cedric's memory in the way that he did and teaching them how to fight in case they need to defend themselves, and for him to thank her for believing him when most people didn't and taking his side against Umbridge. If they made amends with each other in Half-Blood Prince and went their separate ways on relatively good terms, that I think would set the stage a little bit better for her coming back to fight in the battle and help for Cho to be a little bit more of a likable and sympathetic character. For Book 7, I don't really have much of anything. Obviously, with the main trio being away from Hogwarts for a long time, most Ravenclaw student or adult characters don't play a very important role. However, Luna does play an important role in Deathly Hallows. Professor Flitwick and several of the older Ravenclaw students help to defend the castle. The Ravenclaw common room is shown, and it is awesome, and I love the whole thing with having to answer a riddle to get in. The backstory with the Grey Lady and the lost diadem and everything, I found that to be really interesting. Basically, Ravenclaw House is not featured all that prominently in Deathly Hallows, but it does play a more important role than Hufflepuff, and is less homogeneously terrible than Slytherin. So, I'll take what I can get as far as that's concerned. So that was the third of my 3 videos on what I would change about the Hogwarts houses. If you liked this and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday.